And this is Module 3, Lesson 7. And in this module, we'll be looking at what goes into the product backlog. In the previous lesson, we looked at the third artifact. After that's the product increment. After we've gone through the first artifact, the first Scrum artifact, which is the product backlog, then the second artifact, which is the sprint backlog. So here we go. What goes into the product backlog? By now we have good understanding what the product backlog is. Product backlog contains all the work items, the task to deliver a particular product. So let's jump into the class. Epics, features, and stories. Epics, features, and stories. By now we know what stories are. Stories are also called user stories, and we'll be seeing why we call it user stories in this particular class. Epics, features, and stories. Epics are the bigger chunks. Big stories that require decomposition. Epics are components of the enterprise vision. So there is the vision here. The vision is broken into epics. So in the same illustration we've been talking about as narration for the practicals, training, we've been using building a house as the narration. In that same illustration, let's look at the vision, enterprise vision, the vision itself. Let's add vision here and put vision. No, vision. So that's vision. So let's say the vision is building the house. That's the vision. So the vision would make the project itself or the product. So when we can break that vision into smaller bits, into smaller chunks, so that will give us that transparency needed for that particular project. In this case, let's break the house project into what we have here. And that's exactly what we have on the board. Is house project, that's the vision, broken down into epics. Approver for the house, foundation for the house, block work for the house. So in this block wall, we'll look at lintel, the window structure, the door, and all the rest. Then the roofing, plastering, mechanical works, finishing. Of course, these are just few of them. We actually um, developed this or populated this for training purpose. So we can see the vision, house projects. We can now see the epics for that particular project. So if we open inside each of these epics, we've done this in module 2. So inside these epics, we have the stories. What we have here, if we go by this, let's go by this, then we'll relate to that. On the board, inside the epics, we have stories. But in this illustration, inside epics, we have features. And why we have that is this. Epics are the big stories. that require decomposition. Decomposition means breaking them down. Epics are components of the enterprise vision, and epics, um, the business value can best be estimated at this level, at the epic level, the business value. Meaning, what is the value of foundation, of approval? What is the value of foundation? So that value, when we go further and when we get into prioritization, we see how comes to play. Value helps us determine what we want to deliver first. That's what that's making reference to here. Business value can best be estimated at this level because it's a big block, so we can have clear understanding what the value that big block of work would deliver to us. Then feature is a subset of an epic that comprises of a chunk of functionality. Is that functionality that determines the feature that delivers business value, right? The functionality that would determine business value. If we want to add functionality to this, for instance, when we get to, let's use block wall for as an example, we could decide that lintel formation would be a functionality, right? Or we have window casement as a functionality. It's a it's a component that has a function. That particular function, if we pick window casement as a functionality, that window casement will now have other tasks within it, other stories, talking about the glass, talking about the aluminum frame, talking about the tint on the glass, talking about the measurement and different things like that. So that's why we have features or feature under epic here. Epic is the big block. So on the job, you want to look out for what the epic is. It's best to define business value at the epic level. When you get to the feature, you are looking at the functionality. So a subset of the epic that comprises of a chunk of functionality that delivers business value. Then user stories are written from the user's perspective. This is very important. The user stories, they are written from the user's perspective. When we go into the next slide, we will see what a user story um, looks like. Another user story still, you follow the inverse characteristics. That's the inverse criteria, which we are familiar with now. Inverse standing for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. Right? So note that the user stories is from the user's perspective, not from technical perspective. Then lastly, we have task. So you could have task inside user story written by developers or the team who would execute that particular task. This is a side note here which we would be considering when we get to estimates. User stories are measured in story points. You've listened to me mention story points again and again from time to time. So user stories are best measured in story points. Story pointing is not the only measurement of stories. Effort plus complexity plus uncertainty will give us a story point. When we go further, we would expatiate on this. All right, so just note that we have epic at the top, you have features, you have user stories, and you have tasks. Depending on the structure of your organization and what they decide, On Jira, of course, we are making use of Jira. On Enterprise Jira, there is a level above. There are two levels actually on Enterprise Jira that they could also introduce to the board. There is the capability and there is the initiative. That's on Enterprise Jira. But you don't need to bother about these two. Just note that you have the epic. Epics are big stories, big blocks of the vision. You have features. Features focusing on functionality. Features are not different from user stories, but this time around you are putting similar user stories that would deliver a feature. Similar user stories that would deliver a feature. For instance, a login journey. A login journey, a customer wants to log in to a particular platform. There are different stories, and for that login journey, different stories will deliver that feature of logging in, right? So features focus on functionality. Then user stories note it should be written from the user's perspective. Then the task should be the developers interpreting the stories on how they would execute it, what they need to do to execute the task. Next slide, please. So here is what we call the user story, and this is the format for user story. Writing a user story. It has three elements: the user, the goal, and the benefits. Mind you, in the last slide, we said the user story should be written from the angle of a user, not from a technical angle, from the end user's angle, from the end user's view. So it has as a user, I want to, the goal, so that, and that is what we have here. This is the user to user. This is the goal, what you want to do, and this is the benefits, right? As a product owner, which you are in this training or learning as a product owner, I want to write a well descriptive story. That is what you want to do, so that the developers will understand what needs to be done. That is the benefit it will give the developers. Another user story example: as a developer, I want to create an explainer video on interviews. That is what you want to do, so that the stakeholders will have clarity on my understanding. That is the benefits. So user stories have three elements: who is writing it, what is being or who is doing it, what is being done, and the benefits of what would be done. That is the three elements a user story has. However, there is this addition to your story, to your card. We will see what I make reference to as a card in the next slide, which is the acceptance criteria. We've mentioned about acceptance criteria in the last lesson, right? So we can see here, define the end user as a end user, specify what they want, that's the goal, what you want to do, and describe the benefits. All these three would form a user story. So in each user story, these three components must be there. You would find in some places that they take time to write user story and just make it two. It's meant to have the three: what needs to be done, the sorry, who is doing what wants to be done and the benefits that would give. The three elements of the user story must be there. Where the acceptance criteria would be added is, how do we know that what I want to do is now done? So in these two examples we made here, as a developer, I want to create an explainer video on interview so that the stakeholder will have clarity on my understanding. So your acceptance criteria, which we acronym AC, would reflect how do we get to know when you have done this. That is what the user story focuses on. Given that, then I want to see this, right? So the user story, the acceptance criteria, is how we test the validity of what is claimed to have been developed. Mind you, we said earlier that the product owner writes the user stories. When we check these stories, I'm sure that we should have them in user story format. Yes, you can see this. As a surveyor, I want to divide the land into components. That is what the surveyor wants to do, so that the dimensions are well distributed. That is the benefit you would have, right? As a surveyor, I want to divide the land into components so that the dimensions are well distributed. In your practicals, we would be checking each of your stories, and we want to see the elements of the three elements of the user stories there. And what that gives the developers is clear understanding of what needs to be done. And what makes this the role of a product owner interesting, you would have observed that I've made quite a lot of reference to the product owner from the angle of the stakeholders, not from technicality, but from the angle of the stakeholder. So you are writing stories from the angle of who wants that particular feature. That is what a product owner does. So in your practicals, again, we would be checking each of your user stories to contain these elements, and when any of these elements is not there, you would be marked down on that particular user story. All right, let's move forward. In this next slide, we are looking at, I made reference to this in one of the classes in module 2 when I mentioned about the 3 C's. The 3 C's, talking about the card, the conversation, and the confirmation. The card, the conversation, and the confirmation. These three, they are also the same as the user story, because what it means is that the card is the story itself, the work item that needs to be done. The conversation represents the N in invest criteria. So meaning in each of the sprint planning session, your team has, we expect to see your story represented by the card, the conversation representing the discussion or what needs to be done, and the confirmation representing the clarity, when developers know exactly what they need to do. It's the same with this: who, what, why. Who, what, Why? Who, what is being developed, and the benefits. Why? Which is also the same as this. The recipient is who would receive it. The action is what is being done, and the value is the benefit we will see from it. So these three, they are representation of the user story from different angles, or different angles rather. So writing product backlog items. A product backlog item should convey all the context needed for the team to deliver an outcome aligned with the value requested. The value requested is the requirement from the stakeholders. The value requested is the requirement from the stakeholders. So the PBI, product backlog item, should carry all the information needed by the development team to deliver exactly what the stakeholders want. Going forward, we now look at, of course, we understand what this means, so I wouldn't take so much time on the inverse criteria again. We know what they mean. I stands for independence, meaning each story standing on its own. N stands for negotiation, that discussion that happens on the story. V stands for valuable, what tangibility is that story giving us. E stands for estimable, we need to have an idea when that piece of story will be delivered. S stands for small, is small enough to be delivered in that sprint. Then T stands for testable, meaning that it demonstrates quality. The value delivered should have quality, right? So moving further, the definition of ready. Under the definition of ready, we have the definition of ready is a set of criteria that a user story or product backlog item must meet before it is ready to be considered for inclusion in a sprint or development cycle. And in module 2, we made lots of emphasis on the definition of ready. When any story has not met the inverse criteria, such a story does not meet definition of ready. When the story also, when the team has no availability to work on that story, or they do not have the capacity, which is the skill set, to work on that story, that means also that that story does not meet definition of ready. This is availability, mind you, and this is capacity. It's not AC standing for acceptance criteria, no, right? So the definition of ready is a set of criteria that a user story or product backlog item, a product backlog item is an item, a work item, a task in the product backlog must meet before it is ready to be considered for inclusion in the sprints. So where the story does not meet definition of ready, it means that story is not ready to sprint. Definition of ready serves as a guideline for the product owner. So you as a product owner, you should equip yourself with good knowledge of what to check out for before a story is ready to sprint. Same as the Scrum Master, When you have a good Scrum Master, the Scrum Master is guiding you to ensure that your story meets definition of ready. So it serves as a guide for the product owner and the development team to ensure that the user stories are well prepared and clear enough for effective planning, estimation, and implementation. So definition of ready is that measurement or that guide or that rule or whatever you want to call it that you are checking each story against before you drop that story in a sprint backlog ready to sprint. Of course, you could keep those stories in a sprint placeholder. Let me show us what a sprint placeholder is. When we go to the backlog again, this sprint is currently on sprint 2. So the active sprint is sprint 2. This sprint 3, sprint 4, they are placeholders for sprints. So you may keep such a story that is not ready to sprint in the placeholder, but it should not come into a sprint that is ready to be commenced if it does not meet the definition of ready. Meaning, if the work item cannot be completed in that sprint. If you don't have time to work on that work item, then it cannot be completed. If you don't have the skill set to deliver it, then it cannot be completed. If the story is too big and it's not independent, then you cannot complete on that story too. The definition of ready helps to avoid misunderstandings and delays during the sprint planning. Why? Because you have planned enough, you have planned well for each of the story. You have ensured that all the details needed to deliver that story is made available for that piece of story. So it helps the team to avoid misunderstandings and delays during sprint planning and ensures that the team can work efficiently on the selected item. So when any developer picks on that story, it's certain that they know such a developer knows what he or she needs to do, and he has the capacity to deliver that piece of story. Moving forward, this is now a format to write acceptance criteria. Most organizations may not follow this format, but it's one of those things a good product owner wants to know. Given, when, then. This is just an addition. The and is just an addition, right? Let's look at this example in writing as an acceptance criteria. Given I am an authorized user, then I want to have a log out button. When I click on the log out button, then I want the system, what the system should do to close current authorization session or redirect me to a particular different page. Given, when, and then, given that I take this step, what it should give me. Given I haven't received email verification, when I click the verification link from it, then the system should execute valid link validation. Given, when, then. Given, when, then. Given that the developer had finished what he claimed he had finished. When I do this, then I should have this. Let's go back a moment. Let's look at this. Yes, this. The product owner, this is a user story. As a product owner, I want to write a well descriptive story so that the developer would understand what needs to be done. So when the developer that wrote this story as a product owner, don't get that confused. A developer jumps on this story and delivers this. So when the developer comes back to say, I have done this, then what do we test what the developer claims that he has done? That's the given, when, and then. Given that the product owner had done what he claims to have done, let's go there again. When I check for the material or the resources, then I should have understanding on what the product owner had done. So that makes it simple and clear enough for the developer to understand what is developing that piece of user story against. And that is the format for the acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria are specific conditions and requirements that must be met for a user story or product backlog item to be considered complete and accepted by the product owner. I mentioned earlier in previous classes that only the product owner can accept a completed piece of work. No one accepts a piece of work as completed but the product owner. It is only the product owner in a Scrum team that accepts a piece of work, right? So an acceptance criteria are specific conditions and requirements that must be met for a user story or product backlog item to be considered complete and accepted by the product owner and stakeholders. The acceptance criteria points to the definition of done. It is not definition of done. Mind you, in the previous class, I was able to show you what the definition of done is, and I made an illustration using you sewing a cloth from a tailor, right? So the acceptance criteria is just a piece of what we call definition of done, but they point to the definition of done and serve as the basis for determining whether the development work has fulfilled the intended functionality and quality standards. So the acceptance criteria is what we check whatsoever any developer claims had been done against. But mind you, the acceptance criteria is written while that work item itself is written too. So it is written early before the developer commences on that particular work item. Acceptance criteria are written collaboratively by the product owner and the development team during either the refinement or the sprint planning on each of the user stories. So you expect to see acceptance criteria in each of the story. So when you are doing your practical also, we would expect to see acceptance criteria. Nothing is written here. Let's try and check to see any story written. Yeah, we can see this one is written. This is the description, the user story, and this is the acceptance criteria, even if this is not written using that acceptance criteria format. So when you are writing your own acceptance criteria should come actually with the each story. On Jira Enterprise, the enterprise version of Jira, there's a separate field for acceptance criteria that you put the acceptance criteria into separately. Right. I think that should be all for this class. Right. Yes, that will be all for this class. So if you have any question, please note them down and send them across. I would be waiting gladly to expand on all these and more. See you in the next class.